Hello and welcome to this video on industry analysis. To be able to value a business, you need to understand the business, and part of understanding the business requires an understanding of the industry that the business operates in. So we're going to discuss industry analysis. The aim of industry analysis is to gain an understanding of the level of competition within your firm's industry. Understanding the level of competition is going to be crucial in being able to forecast if your business is going to be able to generate significant amount of value in the future. In your introductory economics classes, you would have learned a little bit about how economists think about competition. On one end of the scale, we have very, very intense competition between different companies, and we'd call that perfect competition. That means we might have hundreds or thousands of companies producing the same goods or services and competing with each other to gain customers. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have monopoly providers, and they're firms that are the only unique provider of a particular good or service. So in those situations, when there's a monopoly, there's a low number of firms in that there's just one firm providing the good or service, and they have a high amount of influence over pricing levels. And it's a continuum, so we've got in between the two extremes. An oligopoly is when there is a couple of firms providing a service, or we might have a duopoly when there's two firms providing a service or good. And monopolistic competition is where we have maybe 10 or 15 companies providing the goods or service in an industry. So there's a decent amount of competition there. So when you're doing your industry analysis, you'd want to get an idea of what level of competition's in the industry. Is the firm you're valuing a monopoly provider? That is, are they the single firm providing goods or service for which there's no close substitutes? If that's the case, that's a really great position for a company to be in because they can be a price maker. They can set the prices at a much higher level compared to if there was intense competition. When a business is a monopoly, it has to maintain that position. So there's usually some sort of reason why they are a monopoly. There must be some sort of limited ability for competitors to enter the market. And these reasons could be due to patents, geography, regulation, technology, licensing agreements, and all of these reasons prevent competition or they create barriers to entry. And when a firm's a monopoly, they can generate economic profits, which means profits that are much higher than their cost of capital, which allows them to generate significant value for their shareholders. So firms operating in a monopoly kind of position within an industry are reasonably rare. However, they do exist. And one of the reasons is due to regulation. So for example, Sydney Airport. Regulation means there's no competition for Sydney Airport. There are no other large international airports in Sydney at the moment. And when the Western Sydney Airport does eventually open up, that will create some level of competition. But it was a highly regulated decision for a long time to only have one airport in Sydney. And it meant the airport had a monopoly and they were able to charge much higher prices to their customers. And the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, in this article discusses how Sydney Airport again boosted revenues and profits from the fees at Slugs Airline. And the competition regulator says it's a monopoly. And they're using that monopoly to increase their prices and their customers have nothing that they can do about it. There's nowhere else they can go and do business. Sometimes monopolies can occur due to geographic restrictions. In this article here, we have some lovely pink diamonds. And the majority of the world's pink diamonds come from one particular mine called the Argyle mine. And that's responsible for over 90% of the world's supply. So pink diamonds are highly valued and the prices for pink diamonds are incredibly high. And that's because there's a monopoly. The mine that produces pink diamonds only occurs one place in the world. It's got one sole owner who can then set the prices for these pink diamonds incredibly high. In highly technologically advanced industries such as pharmaceuticals, patents are often a source of preventing competition and creating barriers to entry. So pharmaceutical companies will have patents protecting their drugs and their discoveries from being copied by their competitors. So for example, here, the value of some of the patents that would be expiring in 2016, we can see some patents are worth billions and billions of dollars, and they create temporary monopolies for the companies that have patents that cure or prevent certain diseases. Another source of a business having a monopoly position in an industry is due to their technological superiority. So for example, when we search things on the internet, most of us use Google. This figure here shows that Google have about a 92% market share in the search industry, and that's close to being a monopoly position. Their next biggest competitor, being at 2.44%, is so small that Google effectively operate a monopoly in this industry. Sometimes businesses have a first mover advantage and they're able to grow so quickly they generate economies of scale that then prevents other firms from competing with them because they just won't be able to compete on price. So having a large advantage with economies of scale can prevent competition. And in this article here, it talks about how Google is facing antitrust investigation by 50 US states and territories, and that regulators around the US are very concerned about the effect Google have on smaller companies and how they compete with them. And also in Europe, European regulators have also fined Google a lot of money for their position as a monopoly and how they've been competing with smaller players and using their pricing power and their size as an advantage to crush smaller opposition. So overall, monopolies are rare, but they do exist. And if you're valuing a firm that is a monopoly, they'll have much higher pricing power and they'll be able to extract higher economic gains out of their customers. A more common industry structure that we'll see slightly more often than monopolies is a duopoly or oligopoly. And this means there's going to be a small number of sellers in a particular market. So in Australia, if you think of the supermarkets, you think of Woolworths and Coles controlling most of the market. In the banking industry, we think of the big four banks. In the auditing industry, we think of the big four auditing firms. These would be oligopolies. There's a small number of providers of a service or good that control the vast majority of the market. This creates barriers to entry for new competition, because if I want to start a bank, it's going to be very hard for me to compete with the big four. And in duopolies and oligopolies, there is an ability to earn economic profit, especially if the firms are not competing on price. The danger for oligopolies and duopolies is if they don't compete on price, or if they get together and fix prices amongst themselves, that could be creating what's called a cartel. And in Australia, just a couple of years ago, we had our first prosecution on cartel behavior, where some company executives got together and were trying to make sure all the different steel companies charged a similar price for their products so that there was no competition between the different firms. When we get to the other extreme of behavior, we've got perfect competition. In perfect competition, there's multiple suppliers of nearly identical goods and services. So when you think about going to a cafe or a restaurant, there's hundreds of different cafes in a place like Sydney. There's probably thousands of different restaurants, and they all offer similar goods and services, and they have to compete very aggressively with each other. There's no or very little barrier to entry to starting one of these businesses. There's no regulation preventing you or patents preventing you from getting into these markets. You just need a little bit of money to get in there and set up shop. Another situation in which perfect competition exists is commodity markets. If I'm a gold mining company, when I go and sell the gold to the market, there is a gold price, and I will sell my gold at that price. I can't very easily brand or market my gold as being particularly special and getting a higher price. So I just have to take whatever the market price is at the time I'm selling my gold. So agricultural commodities, mining, and resources are often in perfect competition. So it's very important that you understand the level of competition your firm faces, and getting a good understanding of the industry helps you understand if the industry is highly competitive, such as in perfect competition or close to it, or if it's not very competition and maybe it's in an oligopoly or monopoly kind of situation. Furthermore, understanding the industry will allow you to get a better idea of what sort of strategy will work for your firm, because different strategies will be effective in different industries. In this figure here, we list a whole range of different industries and their profitability. Their return on invested capital is listed. And these are US company or US industries between 1992 and 2006. So we can see different industries have different levels of profitability. It's going to be a function of the level of competition and other industry characteristics, which we'll talk about, which allows us to gain an idea of which industries are going to be really successful and which industries are going to struggle to generate profit. So the framework we're going to be using to analyze an industry is called Porter's 5 Forces. You may have seen it previously. It's a very popular way of analyzing an industry, and it tries to break down an industry into 5 main forces that will affect the profitability of any given industry. So here in the center, we've got industry profitability. And industry profitability is driven by these 5 forces. Let's have a look at each of these forces. I'd highly recommend you look up on YouTube this interview of Michael Porter, the professor who actually created Porter's 5 forces. He'll explain it to you in much more detail. Please check out this video, the link's here, and I'll post it online as well. Furthermore, it's a great idea to read from the professor himself, read Professor Porter's article, The 5 Competitive Forces That Shape Strategy. I'll make sure that's up online for you to read. It's published in the Harvard Business Review in 2008. It'll give you a much deeper understanding of Porter's 5 forces, and I'll just be going over the forces at a shallow level. Check out his interview, read his paper to make sure you get a much deeper understanding of these forces. So the first force, rivalry among existing firms. If there's a high level of rivalry between existing firms, it's going to have a price effect. It's going to push prices towards the marginal cost of production, which means your profit margins will be reduced, and it means it's much harder to generate a return that is higher than your cost of capital. When there's a high level of rivalry, it's going to be much more important for firms to compete on non-price dimensions, because if there's a lot of different firms in an industry and they're all competing on price, your profitability is going to be very low. So in highly competitive industries, it's important to have non-price dimensions, so some sort of differentiated strategy, or you have to be the lowest cost producer. How intense the competition is within an industry is driven by some of these factors. So the industry growth rate is important. Now, we can't evaluate the industry growth rate on its own. If an industry is growing really rapidly, it may mean that all the companies are happy because they're all able to grow at the same time, grow their revenues while maintaining market share. However, maybe if an industry is shrinking, the only way to grow your revenue is to increase your market share, and you have to compete really aggressively with other firms. But it's not always that way. Sometimes industries that are growing really rapidly still do have high levels of competition and a lot of aggressive strategies between firms. The concentration and balance of competitors is important. So you might have an industry that has 10 big players, but one of those players may dominate the others, and they may have a different position with the industry compared to others. So if you think about the computing industry, Apple sort of have their own segment of the computing industry. They're very different to all the other companies in there. So they have a different level of concentration or balance of power within the industry. You also need to consider the degree of differentiation. Is it easy to switch between firms? Can I easily go from one supermarket to another? Yep. So if it's easy for customers to switch products or service providers, the competition levels will probably be higher there. You need to think about excess capacity and exit barriers for businesses if they're going to affect the rivalry. If there's an exit barrier and it's very expensive to exit your industry, you're going to compete really aggressively before you actually do decide to quit. If there's excess capacity, that is, you're only using half of your manufacturing facility, you may then use the other half just to get lower prices and compete really aggressively just to make sure you're utilizing all your capacity. And that also leads to scale and learning economies and how they affect your pricing, and that also leads to increased competition. The second of the 5 forces is the threat of new entrants. The ease with which a new firm can enter an industry will affect the profitability of other firms within the industry. We all know Google is a very profitable company, but they don't really have much of a threat of new entrants. It's so difficult to set up your own search engine and gain market share from Google that not many competitors are even bothering to try. Microsoft tried it with Bing, but Google had such a strong first mover advantage. They had such an economy of scale, their technology was better. It just made it very difficult for anyone else to come in and compete. So the threat of new entrants in the search engine market is pretty low just because of some of these first mover advantages and the technological barriers Google have put up. In other areas, the threat of new entrants may be low due to legal barriers. For example, Sydney Airport had a low threat of new entrants because there was regulation preventing anyone from competing with them. And if another airport was to be built, they got the first dibs at that. They were able to choose whether or not they wanted to be the person who got to own and operate the second airport. So if there's low threat of new entry, that lowers the level of competition and it may lead to higher levels of profitability within an industry. The threat of substitute products also influences an industry's level of competition. A substitute product is something that does a similar function and fulfills the same need or want from the customer. So for example, If I want to travel from Sydney to Brisbane, I could fly. A substitute product would be I could hire a car or buy a car and drive. Or I could get a boat and catch a cruise up there. I could ride my bike. I could walk. These are all transportation methods. So the substitute product for one transportation method is another transportation method. It's not a direct competition, such as there are multiple airlines which are rival firms in the same industry. But the difference between catching a plane and driving, that would be substitute products for transport. So if the product or service you're providing has really close substitute products, the differential pricing between those will influence the level of competition within an industry. The bargaining power of buyers can also influence industry competition, because if buyers have a lot of bargaining power, they can exert downward pressure on prices. So it depends on a range of factors, such as the number of buyers, the buyer's price sensitivity, the volume per buyer, switching costs, differentiation between providers. All of these factors influence how the bargaining power of buyers influences the industry's competition. So for example, if I'm providing a product and there are only one or two buyers for my product, they're going to have a lot of power over me as to negotiating the sales price. So for example, car manufacturers have a lot of outsourcing arrangements where, for example, Toyota may hire a much smaller firm to make one or two parts for a particular car. Now, that company that's making those one or two parts for Toyota, they can only sell those parts to Toyota. So when they negotiate pricing, Toyota get a lot of power in that negotiation. So this small firm that's making parts for Toyota, they can't just jack up the prices a lot, or Toyota will just go to another manufacturing firm and get them to make the products. Okay, so depending on how many buyers you have influences your bargaining power. If there are hundreds and hundreds of buyers for a product, the bargaining power and the dynamics shift again. The opposite for the bargaining power of suppliers is true. So we have to consider both the bargaining power of customers or buyers and suppliers and how they influence the industry. So suppliers have bargaining power when there are few substitutes and or few suppliers relative to the number of customers demanding a product or service. In the airline industry, if you want to buy an aeroplane, there are two suppliers. You've got Boeing and Airbus. So if I'm running an airline and I need to buy airplanes, I actually don't have much bargaining power in terms of the price of the airplane. Boeing and Airbus have a lot of bargaining power because they know there's not really much choice in terms of where you can go and buy an airplane if you want to run your own airline. So with that example in mind, let's think about the aviation industry in Australia in a little bit more detail. Let's apply Porter's 5 forces very quickly to it. The aviation industry in Australia, the number one firm there is going to be Qantas. And if we were analysing the aviation industry, we would want to break it up into both the domestic and international. The domestic and international industries have very different dynamics. There's different firms competing in those spaces, so a separate analysis would be appropriate there. If we're looking at regional domestic airlines, Qantas compete with Virgin, who have recently had a lot of trouble and declared or recently went into administration, and also Regional Express or Rex, who also do local flights within Australia. So they would be the firms that Qantas are competing with, and they'll compete on which routes they offer, the prices, the luxury of the flights, the safety. All those factors will be aspects which the firms compete on. If we're looking at the rivalry among existing firms internationally, it's much more intense. There's hundreds of international airlines around the world, and there are firms that are much bigger than Qantas, smaller than Qantas, and it's a really intense rivalry for the international flight market. We know Qantas competing with Singapore Airlines, Etihad, Emirates, Delta. All these international airlines all compete with flights coming into and out of Australia and flying the same routes that Qantas do. So overall, the domestic versus international markets would probably say there's a different level of rivalry among existing firms. For the international market, the rivalry is much higher. There's more firms, there's different aspects of competition, price, safety, comfort, all those aspects are all competed on. Whereas in the domestic market, the competition's much lower, especially with Virgin struggling at the moment. The threat of new entrants in the aviation industry, there are from time to time new airlines that pop up. So it's not none, but it's not a regular occurrence that Qantas have to deal with new competitors. So it's somewhere medium to low in terms of the threat of new entry. It's not an industry that's making a lot of money. It's not an industry that's been highly profitable in the past. And at the moment, with all the quarantines and lockdowns, it's a really unprofitable industry. So I would say the threat of new entrants at the moment would be much lower than historically. And what about substitute products? Well, again, the international versus the domestic markets are very different. If I want to get from Australia to London, then I can fly or I can get a boat. I certainly can't drive or ride my bike or walk over there. So the threat of substitute products is pretty low. Back in my grandparents' generation, my grandma came over from England and she caught a boat. But if I wanted to go between Australia and England, I probably wouldn't choose a boat. I would hop on a flight. So the substitute products for the international market are reasonably low. Sometimes people will cruise around the Pacific. That's about it. However, domestic markets, do I fly from Sydney to Canberra? Or do I take about a 3-hour drive? Then there's a lot more of a threat of substitute products in those short. But for Australia, the Sydney to Melbourne route is the most profitable for airlines, and that's quite a long drive, 8 or 9 hour drive. Most people will choose to fly instead of drive that distance. So the threat of substitute products for that particular route is reasonably low. So let's think about the bargaining power of customers. Who are the customers? Well, generally we can have retail customers like ourselves. We go onto a website and we book a flight. With the advent of things like Skyscanner and Webjet, the bargaining power of customers is much higher. But there are also commercial customers. They might be the people who are running the commercial operations, say, for example, of UTS, who might be buying in normal times thousands of flights a year. They could be people like Flight Centre who are operating travel agencies. So they might have more bargaining power over a supplier like Qantas because they're buying in bulk and they want to get good deals for their customers. However, for me and you, we don't have too much bargaining power. We see the price Qantas advertised. If we ring up and ask for a discount, they're 99.9% of the time going to say no. We can't negotiate the price, but we can switch between suppliers pretty easily a lot of the time. And the bargaining power of suppliers, well, Boeing and Airjet have a huge amount of bargaining power here. They are the only two companies that are making the type of planes that Qantas need to buy. So they set the price and then Qantas pretty much have to say yes. There's not a lot of opportunity for Qantas to negotiate there. So if international travel was a very profitable industry, Boeing and Airbus will be able to increase their prices a lot more and Qantas will have to accept it. So Boeing and Airbus will be the ones taking all the profit from the industry rather than the actual airline who has to deal with the high bargaining power of suppliers. So this was a very quick analysis, but if we look at the actual data, we can see airlines on average are the least profitable industry in the US. They have an average return on invested capital of 5.9% from 1992 to 2006. It's an incredibly competitive industry. It's very hard to have a high level of profit in the industry because your suppliers have so much power. There's high levels of competition. There are the threats of substitute products in domestic markets. So the airline industry is not very profitable historically. If we think about it now with all the travel problems that are going on, it will be an even less profitable industry. And for most airlines, they'll be making losses in at least this year and probably a couple of years into the future as well. So Porter's 5 forces allowed us to kind of predict that this industry would probably have low levels of profit. When you're doing an industry analysis, there are other things you need to consider. You need to think about the regulation your firm faces within the industry. What are the success factors in the industry? Different positions. And also remember the facts and figures. What's the size of the industry? What's the growth rate? What's your firm's market share? Who are the competitors and their market share? Make sure you have all those facts and figures before you start thinking about Porter's 5 forces, before you start thinking about perfect competition to duopolies and monopoly positions. You need to have a good understanding of all aspects of the industry when you're doing your industry analysis. So overall, in conclusion, the industry analysis is a really important aspect of valuing a business. You need to understand the business to value the business. You need to understand if they're operating in an industry which is likely to be able to generate high levels of profitability, or if it's so competitive, the profitability levels will be competed away. The economic analysis is also going to feed into your industry analysis, and it's going to influence your conclusions in the industry analysis as well. To finish off, I recommend you pause this video and have a look at these practice questions, go through and think about the different aspects of competition and industry structure here. Give it a go and let me know in the comments or on the discussion board your answers, and I'll thank you very much.